For many people, joint stiffness doesn't come from doing something obviously wrong. It often comes from repeating the same quiet routines for years. Have you ever noticed how discomfort can feel worse in the morning, even on days when the day before seemed perfectly ordinary? You rested, you moved carefully, you ate what felt sensible, and yet the stiffness is still there. Over time, many people begin to accept this as just part of getting older. And while there's some truth in that, it's not the whole picture. What's less often talked about is how gently inflammation develops. It rarely arrives suddenly. More often, it builds through small, repeated signals the body receives every day. Signals that come not only from movement or stress, but from habits so familiar we barely notice them anymore. If this is your first time here, welcome to Senior Health Conversations. This is a space where we take a calm, practical approach to health without blame or pressure. Understanding how the body responds to everyday choices can be surprisingly reassuring because it shifts the conversation away from what's broken and toward what's still responsive. That awareness often brings a sense of relief, not because there's a quick fix, but because there's room to make thoughtful adjustments over time. And this is where our conversation really begins. Before looking at specific foods or habits, it helps to understand why so many people focus only on joint pain itself, while missing the quieter influences that allow inflammation to linger in the background. That perspective is the foundation for everything we'll talk about next. When joint discomfort becomes a regular part of life, it's natural to focus on the joints themselves. We notice where it hurts, when it stiffens, and how long it takes to loosen up. And most of the advice we receive tends to point us in the same direction. Manage the pain, protect the joint, keep moving carefully. Those steps matter, but they don't always tell the full story. What many people don't realize is that joints don't exist in isolation. They respond to what's happening throughout the body. Inflammation, in particular, is not a local issue. It's a system-wide process, influenced by signals coming from many places at once. This is where a quiet misunderstanding often settles in. People assume that if joint pain is present, something must be wearing out or breaking down. That belief can feel discouraging, as if the body is simply running out of options. But inflammation doesn't work that way. It's dynamic. It responds to patterns, not just damage. Think about how inflammation shows up. Stiffness that's worse in the morning, swelling that changes from day to day, discomfort that seems to flare without a clear reason. These patterns suggest that something ongoing is influencing the body beneath the surface. And very often, that influence comes from everyday routines we consider normal. What we eat, how often we eat it, and how processed those foods are all send messages to the immune system. Over time, repeated signals can encourage the body to remain in a low-grade inflammatory state. Not enough to cause immediate alarm, but enough to keep joints feeling sensitive and slow to recover. This isn't about blaming food or turning meals into something stressful. It's about recognizing that food acts as information. The body reads it, interprets it, and adjusts accordingly. For many people, this realization brings relief. It shifts the focus away from the idea that joints are failing and toward the understanding that the body is responding logically to its environment. And environments can be adjusted. That doesn't mean making dramatic changes overnight. It means becoming curious instead of critical, observing patterns instead of judging them. Before we talk about what to change, it's important to understand why certain foods have more influence than others, and why so many people remain unaware of their effects in the first place. Because once you see where those signals are coming from, the path forward becomes much clearer. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. Once people begin to understand that inflammation responds to everyday patterns, a natural question follows. If food sends signals to the body, why do so many of us miss the ones that matter most? One reason is that modern food rarely looks the way it used to. Ingredients are no longer just foods we recognize. They're often broken down, combined, and renamed in ways that sound technical rather than familiar. As a result, many people assume that if something is sold openly and labeled neatly, it must be reasonably supportive of health. But labels don't always tell the full story at a glance. Many packaged foods contain components designed to improve texture, flavor, and shelf life. These additions serve a purpose for manufacturing and convenience, but inside the body, they can create signals the immune system reads as irritation or imbalance. Not dramatically, and not all at once, but quietly and consistently. This is why inflammation can feel confusing. You might eat what appears to be a sensible breakfast, only to notice stiffness later in the morning. Or you may enjoy a familiar meal and wake the next day feeling heavier in the joints, without understanding the connection. It's not that these foods are bad in a moral sense. It's that their structure and processing can encourage the body to remain slightly inflamed, especially when they're eaten frequently over long periods of time. Another layer of confusion comes from how ingredients are listed. Some inflammatory triggers aren't labeled in plain language. They're described using scientific or industrial terms that don't resemble anything from a home kitchen. Without guidance, it's nearly impossible for the average shopper to recognize what those terms might mean for joint health. And this is where many people lose confidence. They begin to feel that food choices are too complicated, or that understanding labels requires specialized knowledge. So they stop questioning and return to familiar routines. The truth is, you don't need to analyze every ingredient or memorize long lists. What matters more is recognizing patterns. Foods that are heavily processed, designed to be eaten quickly and stripped of their original structure, tend to send different signals to the body than foods closer to their natural form. When people begin to notice these patterns, something important happens. The conversation shifts from restriction to awareness, from fear to curiosity. Instead of asking, "What am I not allowed to eat?" the question becomes, "What might be encouraging inflammation without me realizing it?" And once that question is asked, the next step becomes much clearer. Because there are a few broad categories of foods that consistently show up in the diets of people experiencing ongoing joint discomfort. They're not rare, they're not exotic, and they often come dressed as everyday staples. That's what we'll look at next. At this point, many people begin to wonder whether there are specific types of foods that tend to show up again and again when joint inflammation lingers, not as a single cause, but as part of a pattern. And the answer is yes. There are a few broad categories that consistently appear in everyday diets, often without much thought. What's important to understand is that these foods are common not because people are careless, but because they're convenient, familiar, and often marketed as sensible choices. Let's start with the first category, highly processed carbohydrates, especially those found in packaged breakfast foods and snacks. These foods are designed to be quick, shelf-stable, and appealing, Over time, however, their structure can lead to rapid changes in blood sugar and insulin levels. When this happens repeatedly, it can encourage the body to remain in a mildly inflammatory state. For people with sensitive joints, this often shows up as stiffness that seems worse in the morning, or discomfort that appears shortly after eating. The connection isn't always obvious, which is why it's easy to miss. The second category involves industrially refined vegetable oils. These oils are widely used in packaged foods, takeaway meals, and even home cooking. While fats are an essential part of a healthy diet, the type and balance of fats matter. Many refined oils are heavily processed and high in certain fatty acids that, when consumed frequently, can tip the body toward inflammation. This doesn't mean fats are harmful. It means balance is important. When the body receives far more of one type than another, it adjusts its inflammatory response accordingly. For some people, this imbalance contributes to joints that feel swollen or uncomfortable by the end of the day, even if movement has been gentle. The third category is processed meats. These include meats that have been cured, smoked, or preserved for long shelf life. The processing methods used to create these products can introduce compounds that place additional stress on the body's inflammatory pathways. When eaten occasionally, many people tolerate these foods without noticeable issues. But when they become a regular part of meals, they can contribute to ongoing joint sensitivity, especially in individuals already dealing with inflammation. What links all three categories is not that they are inherently bad, but that they are highly processed and designed for convenience rather than nourishment. Over time, frequent exposure to these foods can keep the immune system slightly activated, even in the absence of injury or infection. This is why inflammation can feel unpredictable. It's not always triggered by one meal or one choice. It builds through repetition. The encouraging part of this conversation is that patterns work both ways. When people begin to reduce their reliance on heavily processed foods and replace them with options closer to their natural form, many notice subtle but meaningful changes. Joints may feel less stiff. Mornings may feel a little easier. Movement may require less effort. These changes don't happen because the body has been fixed, but because it's no longer receiving the same inflammatory signals day after day. It's also important to say this clearly. None of this requires perfection. You don't need to eliminate entire food groups or follow strict rules. The body responds to trends over time, not isolated moments. Awareness is the first step. Once you recognize which categories tend to show up most often in your own routine, you can begin to make small, thoughtful adjustments. And small adjustments, when they're consistent, are often enough to shift how the body feels. In the next part, we'll move away from what to limit and focus instead on what to include. Foods and habits that help calm inflammation and support joint comfort without making daily life feel restrictive. That's where balance begins to replace frustration. After talking about patterns that can quietly support inflammation, it's important to pause and reset the tone of this conversation. Because the goal here isn't to create worry or guilt, it's to remind you that the body is far more adaptable than we often give it credit for. One of the most reassuring things about inflammation is that it responds to change, not instantly and not dramatically, but gradually and reliably when the signals it receives begin to shift. Many people are surprised to discover that their bodies are not stuck in discomfort. Instead, they've simply been responding to the same inputs day after day. When those inputs change, even slightly, the body adjusts in return. This is where hope becomes practical. Supporting joint comfort doesn't require a complete overhaul of your diet or lifestyle. It starts with adding more of what the body recognizes and responds to calmly. Foods that are closer to their natural state. Fats that support balance rather than push the body towards stress. Meals that leave you feeling steady rather than sluggish. Just as importantly, it involves removing pressure from the process. Progress doesn't come from doing everything perfectly. It comes from consistency and awareness over time. Many people notice that when inflammation begins to settle, movement feels a little easier. Morning stiffness doesn't dominate the day as much. Energy becomes more stable. These shifts are often subtle at first, but they're meaningful because they signal that the body is responding. It's also worth remembering that joint health isn't just about food. Sleep, stress, and daily rhythm all play a role in how the body manages inflammation. When these elements are supported together, the effect tends to be greater than any single change on its own. What matters most is this perspective. Discomfort doesn't define the future. The body is always responding to what it's given, and that response can move in a more supportive direction. In the final part of this conversation, we'll focus on how to turn this understanding into simple, manageable steps you can begin using in everyday life. Nothing complicated, nothing overwhelming, just practical ways to move forward with more confidence and less frustration. As we come to the end of this conversation, it's worth taking a moment to bring everything together in a way that feels manageable. Because understanding inflammation isn't meant to add pressure. It's meant to give you clarity. Nothing we've discussed today requires you to change everything at once. In fact, trying to do too much too quickly often makes people give up altogether. The body responds best to steady, realistic adjustments. A helpful place to start is with just one small change. Not the most dramatic one, but the one that feels easiest to maintain. That might be choosing a different type of oil for cooking. It might be swapping a packaged snack for something simpler a few times a week. Or it might be paying closer attention to how certain meals leave your joints feeling the next morning. When you approach this process with curiosity instead of rules, it becomes far more sustainable. It can also be useful to think in terms of short periods of observation. Rather than asking yourself to fix anything, you can simply notice how your body responds over a week or two. Many people find that even modest changes can bring subtle improvements in comfort, energy, or ease of movement. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. If you found this conversation helpful, you're very welcome to like the video. It helps others who are looking for a calmer, more practical approach to health find their way here as well. You might also consider subscribing to Senior Health Conversations if you'd like to continue exploring ways to support your health with clarity and balance. New videos build on these ideas step by step, without overwhelm. If you feel comfortable, you can leave a comment below sharing one small change you're considering, or simply what stood out to you today. These conversations grow stronger when experiences are shared. In the next video, we'll take a closer look at specific food choices that can help support joint comfort in everyday meals. Until then, take things gently and trust that small, consistent steps truly do matter.